my friend Dr. Arvind Pandriya. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It's always a pleasure to be at any YI event. One of the disadvantages of a YI event is that all the arrangements tend to be designed for people who are much younger than me. For example, these lights are so bright that I imagine that you can probably count every wrinkle that we have between us.
No, but actually the bright lights are then complemented by the glow of the youth of India.
Is that so? Okay. That's right. So we've started off the way we intend to proceed through this session, which is to indeed have a conversation. And it's a conversation that I always look forward to having for different reasons. Arvind, in many ways, is a model for me. He's a model because of his great academic background, but his academic background has never been theoretical. His academic background has always been very powerful and very solid academic research and empirical work, but it's been focused on real-world problems. It's been focused on not just analysis, but then getting those ideas out into the real world in the form of op-eds and opinion pieces, in the form of some of the best books that exist on Indian development over the years. And indeed, he's picked up and worked on many of the most important subjects that we need to deal with as a country. So it's always a pleasure, Arvind, to be with you and to converse.
And I can assure you, I look forward to these conversations with you more than you do.
Thank you. So what we thought we'd do is that I would ask a few questions, and then after that we'll open it up for questions from the audience. By the way, first I should get a time check. How much time do we have, Shaurya? I think we're going to aim to finish at 11:40 on the dot, so 40 minutes. Yeah, is that okay? Yeah,
that's
thanks.
good.
Great. I'm specifically mentioning that so that you have some questions in mind 20 minutes from now. Okay? Right. So let me start with a question. Arvind, a few years ago, I think 3 or 4 years ago, you published a very interesting book called Why Growth Matters. And in that book, you made the argument about the importance of reform, the role that reform had played in the development of the Indian economy, and the role that not only growth played in the economy in terms of making us a much larger and more wealthy economy, but the role that growth had played in alleviating poverty and in addressing many of our most fundamental core issues as a country. And sometimes I think we have misperceptions. We think that reform and growth is for the rich, and that growth benefits the rich. But I think your work shows some very different and much more widespread benefits of growth. And maybe we'll start with that, and I wonder if you could start us off by saying, so, why does growth really matter? And if you look forward over the next 30 years, right, what kind of growth do we really need? And how should one see that flow into the country as a whole?
Let me see. Your question is very wide-ranging, so I could really fill up the remaining 20 minutes answering that single question. But I'll not do that. Let me first say why growth is so important. First of all, when you grow rapidly, so I'm talking of 8-9% growth, the kind of growth that we in fact experienced from 2003-4 to 2011-12. That's a period during which we, believe it or not, we did grow about 8.3% annually, which is roughly what we call 8 to 10% miracle level of growth. When growth happens at that kind of rate, it really does lift all the boats. Now, how does it do? One, it creates gainful employment opportunities. It raises wages. So people who are down below get pulled up, either through gainful employment opportunities or rising wages. Even if they're in the same employment, the wages rise. The second mechanism through which growth helps is that it makes revenues possible. The government now, when the economy grows at 8.5% versus 3 or 4%, then in effect the government's revenues rise very rapidly also. And that, of course, allows social expenditures to become feasible on a much larger scale. So it's no surprise that it is during this particular period of 3-4 to 11-12 when we see massive expansion of our social expenditures. You know, NREGA comes during this period. The public distribution system gets expanded manyfold. You also are able to actually, you know, expand the Sarv Shiksha, scale up the Sarv Shiksha Abhiyan, which eventually culminates in the Right to Education Act in 2009. So a lot of the social expenditures also become feasible as a result of that. And it is not just theory. If you go back and look into the data, as I have done, India does have a good kind of tradition of doing sample surveys. So the National Sample Survey Organization does these surveys every 5 or 6 years on the expenditures by people. And that gives you an indication of how poverty is evolving over time. And if you look, and India has had that going on from about 1951 or so. So you can really track the history of how poverty has evolved in India over the virtually entire 66 year period. And it is during the last two surveys, the big ones, which are spread by about 7 years, 2004-05 survey and 2011-12 survey, you see massive reduction in poverty, massive. The rate at which we never saw poverty come down prior to that. And you can look at it every which way. So you can look at it by aggregate poverty in India. You can then go down to rural versus urban poverty. You can go down to poverty by state, within each state, rural versus urban. And you can do it by social groups. So you can do for what happened to the poverty among the scheduled castes, what happened among the scheduled tribes, other groups. You can do by Hindus, Muslims, whatever which way you cut these data, you see very, very significant decline in poverty. And in fact, where the poverty was initially higher, take for example the scheduled castes, you see a larger decline in poverty than where the poverty initially was lower. So growth does end up helping actually at all sorts of ways.
So what I hear you saying is that it's not only that growth filters through, but the more rapid the growth is,
it's the pull-up effect. I like to call it, you know, people say trickle down, right? People say trickle down. I think that's a very passive kind of term to use. It's almost as if, you know, the crumbs are falling down and the slaves are kind of eating the crumbs and all, you know, all the. Yeah. But that's not how it is. It's the pull-up effect. It really sort of, you know.
So, you know, one of the biggest employment creation areas, it seems to me, is chauffeurs, is drivers. You know, for example, you know, Delhi is supposed to add how many cars a day? I mean, some absurd number, 5,000 cars a day or 8,000 cars a day or something. And I think now in Delhi, if you get a car, you automatically need a driver as well, because otherwise there's not much point, right? So, the one of the most significant employment generation areas has been, it turns out, drivers, security, service functions of that kind, right? And I think those are good examples of just that kind of pull-up effect, not intended,
absolutely,
but a direct pull-up effect.
So a little known fact is that the countries that have sustained growth rates of about 8 to 10%, it usually starts with manufacturing growing much more rapidly. But what happens is that when the incomes in manufacturing sector rise, people spend money. Yes. And that creates demand for services. And the services, of course, largely have to be provided domestically. And so the effect you are talking about is coming exactly in that way.
Right. So, and what you're saying is that the faster it is, the faster the growth is, the stronger the pull-up effect.
Absolutely.
Yeah? Okay. So so looking forward over the next 30 years, if we want a future that is not only high growth, where we become a much larger and more successful economy, but an economy where the average Indian can expect to have a high standard of living, can expect to have minimum access to healthcare, can expect to have a minimum standard of education and opportunities, including in higher education, and can expect to have a constant expectation of a better life, right? If we say that the average Indian has to have those basic human needs addressed, what should we change? What do we need to change to make this growth process even more inclusive than it has been?
So one area, of course, is that our growth has been, the nature of growth has been a bit different. Whereas in some of the earlier success stories, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, after that China more recently, growth happened through the growth of labor-intensive industry, which created lots and lots of jobs. You know, China today exports, for example, $180 billion worth of clothing. It exports about $55 billion worth of footwear, $800 billion worth of electronic and electrical products. So that's the kind of growth that happened. It's created a lot of jobs at good wages. And that, of course, the snowballing effect through these services, etc. So one thing we need to do is to really make the ecosystem better for the labor-intensive industry, so that our industrialists also begin to see the light that work can be performed not just by machines, but it can also be performed by people. I think, you know, there is...
You're particularly looking at me sharply when you say this, I
yes, yes, you know, because our industrialists seem to sort of have become hardwired to think that, you know, anytime they need work done, they should get a machine, not a human being. Yeah. So I think we need to change that. We need the industrialists to go into sectors such as clothing, footwear, electrical machinery, electronic products, etc., where there will be a lot of jobs created. So that's one thing I would say. If we can do that, I really think that the growth rate itself will automatically accelerate, because the other conditions of growth are there actually in place. Our savings rate still remains about 30% plus, will rise to 35, 36%, which we have seen previously in 2007-8. Our demographic, of course, we see that in the room here, is much in our favor. And the scope for productivity increases simply because we are here still at a $1,500 per capita income. So as we progress towards the technology frontier of the global economy, we can very rapidly raise our productivity. So with all that, I think, you know, if we solve this one specific problem of jobs in the country, in the formal sector, in the organized sector,
and high quality jobs, high quality jobs,
you know, so that I think will take us. And if we can do that, you know, now again, this period of 9 years that I mentioned, 3-4 to 11-12, we actually grew 8.3% in real rupees. But if you do the calculation in real dollars, because rupee was appreciating in terms of the dollar, the growth was more than about 11%. Now, if we can get that kind of growth over a period of, let's say, 15 years, from 2 trillion, we will go to about $9 trillion in 15 years. Now, that will get us become the third largest economy right away. You know, we'll pass Germany, will pass UK, will pass Japan, and will be third largest economy.
Thanks. So, you know, if you move to a different topic, which is, you know, how does inequality play out with growth? One way of dealing with inequality is a pull-up effect. You know, you wait for the fruits of growth to start pulling people up. And I love your pull-up phrase instead of the trickle-down phrase. It is indeed much more active and much more a reflection of what happens. The other way is that you provide safety nets and you address people who require help. How do you get the balance right between the two? Because, you know, one can do you focus on the opportunity, or do you focus on outcome? Do you focus on providing a minimum base level for everyone?
No, it's not either or. Certainly, you know, growth will be sustained over a longer period only if it's shared. Otherwise, something to obstruct the growth process itself will come in the way. Good news about India is that, or good news for India is that it is a democracy. So if you really look back at the history of some of the other fast-growing countries that I mentioned, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, China, in all these countries, you know, in effect, there were no social safety nets created in the early stages, of growth. So if you go, these countries start growing in mid-1960s and you come all the way to 1990, and there's not a large discussion of social safety nets, there's direct redistribution programs there. India being a democracy, the redistribution is thought of in the same breath as growth, or even before actually that we talk of growth. So in this sense, I think the democratic system itself is going to ensure that we create these social safety nets. But I think the main thing I would emphasize here is the role of education. That really is very critical. It is also a public good. So therefore, without the government actually doing something about it, some of it can happen through private sector, but certainly things like quality of education, the government has to be involved, it has to do its bit, and that is where I think the most important. If you look at inequality across different groups, like, wage gap between men and women, you look at wage gap between the socially disadvantaged group, the scheduled caste, scheduled tribes, versus the rest. These wage gaps have narrowed down over the years. There's very systematic empirical evidence by a very able economist, Amartya Lahiri. And what he finds actually is that, look, this narrowing of the wage gap largely is explained by education.
So which is the classic liberal view of education as providing a ladder for upward mobility. Yeah, and you're saying that's alive and well in India and working really well.
Yes, I think we're still, the work on education, particularly higher education, is in progress. So we still, need to do better. Also, in elementary education, we need to do better. Quality is a major issue here. And indeed, we have seen at least, some of the surveys by Asar Pratham.
So I'm thinking, this audience consists largely of younger people. Yeah. And I can't see very well into the audience, but we'll try a poll. How many people here are involved in education in some way or the other? So I would say about 200 hands at least in the first half of the room, which is as far back as I can see. So that's a significant number, right? So what would your message be to them? That that this is 200 young people with energy, enterprise ideas involved in education in some way or the other.
I'd say, as an economist, I worry a lot about policy. I have firm belief that good policy is very important. So my advice would be that in addition to whatever else you are doing, also lobby the government very heavily for good and better policies on education. I think, without good policies at the end of the day, efforts will only yield a small fraction of the potential benefit.
So, education is a joint subject in our country, which means concurrent list. Yeah, it's both. So it's both a matter of central policy and state policy, and that sometimes makes it more complicated to make get the right policies implemented in place. What change would you like to see?
No, the fact that it's a subject on the concurrent list cuts both ways, because it then also gives states the power. Yeah. And at Niti Aayog, we really are into promoting cooperative competitive federalism. So some sort of competition among states on the provision of better education itself can yield benefits. But beyond that, I think we also need policy reforms happening both at the central level. Some of these can also be done by the states, by the way, because the present government really takes what the states want to do seriously. And therefore, unlike almost over the last 65 years, the government has allowed state laws to be changed that are on the concurrent list, even though they're in conflict with the central laws.
So I'm hearing you say that if you're involved in education at your state level, if you can come up with the right approaches and the right policies, have your state government say, this is the change we wish to see, and then let's see how we can make that change happen at the central level. I think it's an opportunity for us to push forward. I agree with you that this emphasis on our federal structure is a huge enabler in education and in many other areas.
Absolutely.
Okay. One last question, and then we'll open it up for questions. We're talking to an audience that is much younger than us, and that tends to go with a strong sense of entrepreneurship, a strong sense of, articulating a vision of the future and saying, here's what we should achieve, here's what we should go out and deliver on the ground, whether it's a new business model in manufacturing or services or whatever. But one of the other aspects of a younger audience is that people like to live their own lives. They like to live the lives that is important to them according to their own values, according to what their own interests are. And it seems to me that as an economy, we often focus on all the problems that we have in India. And I think, as I was telling Shaurya the other day, I think the focus of these 2-day session has been so correct and so appropriate in terms of focusing on the things that we can truly be proud of, that we have going for us as a country. One of the things that we are always criticized about as a country is our noisy democracy. I see our noisy democracy as being 90% good and only 10% bad. The 10% bad is what we hear on our news channels every day. The 90% good is what we do not hear on our news channels. It's the diversity, it's the opportunity to contribute in many different areas in many different ways. And I wonder if you can speak a little to that, that how does the fact that we're not China, how does the fact that we're not this clean, organized, systematic place contribute to economic success, contribute to vibrancy, contribute to a positive future for us as a country? I mean, I'm sort of looking for support for my view.
Yeah. Well, this is a story Jagdish Bhagwati tells, that he once went to see Lee Kuan Yew. And Lee Kuan Yew really sort of complained that, your democracy is so noisy and all. So Jagdish's sort of response was that, Mr. President, you hear the noise, I hear the music. And that perhaps says it all. I think, and much of the noise you really see is in the Delhi television media and all. But the rest of it all, just think about it. Europeans today, with far less diversity than India, today are still struggling to become a single state. The whole, movement towards single Europe is ridden with so many difficulties, now even as a single monetary union, the fears that today Greece might drop out of this union or tomorrow Spain might drop out of this union. Quite contrary to that, with, as I said, much greater diversity in India, we have really stayed as a single nation since the independence. And not only we have stayed together, but we have actually, the nationhood feeling has only grown over time. Because, in today's noise, we tend to forget that in the 50s and 60s, if you go back, there were so many of different separatist movements based on language, this, that, and the other. But you don't see that now. We do see ourselves as a single nation. We are there, and no matter what, that's taken now as a given. So I think it's a huge success of Indian democracy. It's a huge success of the design of the Constitution of India, which took the road to this federalism, which recognizes the differences across the states, but also then unifies it as a single nation through the activities of the central government. So I think this is a huge success. I think I will not have it any other way. And in the longer run, we'll also see as we get our growth return to 8 to 10%, and we sustain that over the next 8 to 10 years, or longer actually, not just 8 to 10, but possibly 20 to 30 years, which is perfectly feasible, you'll see that, you know, when all of these youngsters come to my age, they'll see a very different, very, very prosperous India.
Thanks, Ram. So you know, the historian Ramchandra Goa, in his book India After Gandhi, has this wonderful last chapter in the book where he talks about some of the compromises that we made as a country, you know, in terms of, for example, the creation of new states. And new states on, as you know, linguistic lines. And you know, growing up, I was always sort of told that, look, this was a mistake. This was us compromising, which was, you know, a mistake that we were making as a country. And he makes the argument that actually it wasn't a mistake. It was actually a way in which the art of compromise was actually essential to us building this sense of nationhood. And he points out that that Pakistan becoming Pakistan and Bangladesh was the source of that dispute was originally linguistic. The source of the civil war in Sri Lanka was originally linguistic. And it was because they were not willing to accommodate those different interests that those states had serious problems. And India, with its sense of compromise, and somewhat messy compromise and somewhat noisy compromise, still was able to adjust and move on. So,
no, I totally agree with that. That was part of Nehru's pragmatism also. Remember that Nehru also wanted initially a more of a sort of, you know, different kind of where the language will not be the basis and all, but he was a pragmatist, so he went along with that. But also, you know, in a way, if you look back historically, this was not only not a mistake, it was almost a necessity, you know.
Yes.
And if you look at the constitution really and constitutional debates of the time, you know, whereas the French style democracy is a nation state where you basically, you know, require of everybody to learn the French language and become a part of a single kind of that kind of unitary nation. Ours was not a nation state, but was a states nation. It was a nation created by the states. In the end, nation is what the states are. And so therefore, the organization of the states are, along linguistic lines or even cultural, etc., was practically a necessity. And in the way we have been able to actually work with it, it has worked beautifully.
thanks. So let's take some questions from the audience. And okay, I could see a whole bunch of hands, sort of about halfway back. Well, let's start on the left over there. Yeah. Yeah, thanks.
Can we have the lights on, please? The lights in the audience.
That's a good idea.
Could you
So we'll
point the
take
person
that one
out?
there, and then we'll collect what maybe
Sure.
what we, if you like, what we'll do is we'll collect, say, 3 or 4 questions and then address them together and then move on. Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Start. Thanks.
Hi, good morning. This is Pavan from Vishakhapatnam. The question is regarding the discussion you already had about gap and inequality. I personally have this debate always with people saying, like, you know, if the, lowest strata are being pulled up, we don't have to really bother about inequality. Simple thing is, if I can buy 1 car, I should not bother if my neighbors had 2 cars, right? So the question is this inequality really expanding as per statistics from what you have? And should we really bother about it?
So should we worry about inequality at all? Okay, fine. Let's come to the front over here, and then we'll go over to that side. I'm trying to be
Could you point the person
geographically
out?
diverse.
Could you point the person out and hand
Sure.
it
Right
to
here in front, please.
All right.
Thank you.
Sir, I'm Namit Agarwal. I'm from YI Jaipur. We have seen a lot of positivity on the top level of the government to push out reforms and a lot of activities. But we see that the penetration down the line is slow, and perhaps the bottom of the line, we are not seeing that type of effect. How, at top government level, perhaps they are also aware about the situation, handling this situation to take care about it?
Okay. Thank you. And one more. So the lady back there, please, in the pink.
Good morning, I'm Vichitra. I'm from Sivakasi, the land of fireworks. So I come from a long line of industrialists, and we have the same fireworks business that we have in China as well. But what I see is the same cadre of employees at the ground level, the quality of living, their lifestyle, their basic shelter, their home, food, clothing, everything is way ahead of the same employees in India, and we are paying industry norm salaries. So when do you think our employees will get to that same level?
Should we? Okay, one more. We'll take one more. We'll take one. Where? Who's the very insistent okay, fine. So, okay, fine. So, you know, it's one of, this is one of those, this is part of the noisy democracy. So, okay,
So, Utkarsh from Ahmedabad. We have seen, we're talking about the currency. There are nations like Japan, China, they are actually capable of trading in their own currencies in the international market. So, what should be the reforms or what we should do as a part of the economy so that we can make our currency that much developed and strong that US and all these economies have to back in front of us and we can be a greatest economy in the world.
So four questions ranging from economics 1 to economics 1000.
Yes. So inequality. This is a very complicated, because there are many different ways to measure inequality. Right? So the economists use this Gini coefficient, but then Gini coefficient in Bihar or in Kerala or in India as a whole, that's an issue. And then we talk of the differences in wages, the regular workers versus the contract workers, and wage inequality between men and women, all sorts of, So it is important to understand these differences and also to understand which inequality really matters the most. For example, if I live in Bihar and inequality in Kerala rises, that really is not of much concern to me, even though that will contribute to the increase in national inequality. But also we should see the connection between the inequality and poverty very carefully. Now today, some of you will be surprised, I think most of you will be surprised to know that the state with the history of the highest inequality in India has been. Any guesses? No. Delhi is really not a state. I mean, it's a little different status. I mean, it's just, the status is a little different. No, the state actually with the history of greatest inequality, highest inequality over a longer period has been Kerala. And the state which is relatively much more equal, actually probably the most, barring maybe one state, is Bihar. But Kerala is prosperous, Bihar is not. People move from Bihar to Kerala, not from Kerala to Bihar. So what matters also is the average level of income. So, as long as you're raising the incomes of everybody and at a reasonable pace, on the margin, small increases in inequality will not matter. If it increases a lot, then of course it does matter. It does matter. And this is why you have to have these redistribution programs in place so that at least bottom 30 or 40% you carry with you. If you can't carry the bottom 30, 40% with you, you got a problem. So that's where I worry the most about. At the bottom, I sort of disagree actually, because a very important, so this is about, that things are working at the top but not at the bottom. I think at the end of the day, India is nothing but its 29 states and the 5 or 6 union territories. It is the states that drive the whole process. So we got incredibly good chief ministers in a number of different states who are doing terrific work, without whom, as a nation, will not add up to this 8 to 10% growth that we aspire to. So I personally really think that actually today, unlike, if you go back 2 decades or more, we actually have a lot of action happening precisely on the ground, thanks to these very, very able chief ministers in a number of these states. On the wages, why our workers don't get the Chinese wages, I could extend it further, where the Chinese workers, I'm sure, complain, why don't they get the American wages? In the end, it is a matter of, both the fact that we have a very large workforce, but much more so that we still have not attained the kind of level of prosperity and high levels of income that prevail either in China or in the United States. So tomorrow, say in 15 years' time or less, hopefully, if we grow even faster, our wages will get where the Chinese wages are. But we got to work for that. All incomes have to rise.
And it's a productivity question.
It's a productivity question, what productivity is, but yeah. And the currency, I think we have some ways to go. I don't think you should measure the strength of a country necessarily by whether or not it's a reserve currency. But economic prosperity and growth, those are important, So if you want India's democracy to be also be the greatest one on earth, or the largest democracy to be also the greatest one, which is the theme of the session today, in the end, growth, which is also shared widely, is the ultimate answer. The rest will come with it. I think, the currency convertibility or the use of the rupee as a reserve currency, etc., becoming a part of the SDR basket, etc., they will all come with it. But the means to it is rapid and shared growth. So
we're right out of time, so we can't take any more questions. But I'm going to ask you one last question, which is that if you were about to turn 21 today, where would you rather turn 21? In France, in China, or in India? And why?
Look, at 63 years of age, after 40 years, I have returned from the US to India. So the answer should be obvious.
That's right. Thank you.
Here's a token of appreciation from the young Indians to you.